Our guest tonight was referred to by the Wall Street Journal as a star among public intellectuals. His publisher refers to him as the big-brained anthropologist, which seems a bit unkind to me, but he's built his own brand of intellectual blockbuster. He won the Pulitzer Prize for his book Guns, Germs and Steel, which was named one of the top 10 non-fiction books ever published by Time magazine. He's also renowned for his book Collapse, The Third Chimpanzee, and Why is Sex Fun? And he's here to talk about his new book, The World Until Yesterday. He's an avid birdwatcher, learner of languages, professor of geography and of environmental health sciences at UCLA. Please welcome Professor Jared Diamond.
Let me first check whether you'll be able to hear me okay and back. Can you hear back there? It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Australia, and especially to be back in Melbourne. It's now nearly 50 years since I first came to your country. There have been lots of changes going on during that time. It seems to me almost all of them for the better, and you people are lucky to live in this wonderful land which I only get to visit occasionally. I envy you. At the outset, to give me an idea how many of you will find what I'm going to talk about this evening of some practical value, I'd like to ask you to raise your hands in response to either of two questions. First, let me ask you to raise your hand if you are either over 65 years old, or if you expect to live past 65, or if you have a parent or grandparent who did live past 65. In any of those cases, could you raise your hand? All right, those of you just raise your hand, you will find what I'm going to talk about this evening of practical value. Now, let me ask you to raise your hand if you are under 65, if you have no intention or desire of living past 65, and if you have no parent or grandparent who lived past 65. Raise your hand, please. I think I see a couple of people. Those couple of people, what I'm going to talk about this evening will be of no practical interest to you, but instead you will find it fascinating. That's because I'm going to talk about growing older in traditional societies. This subject constitutes just one chapter of my latest book, which compares traditional small tribal societies with our big modern societies with respect to many aspects of society, such as growing older, bringing up children, health, dealing with danger, settling disputes, religion, and speaking more than one language. This is my most personal book, my book, I think, of most practical value to our daily lives, and as someone who has learned to be a shameless author, I hope it's going to be my best-selling book. It's about what I've learned from spending a lot of my time in traditional tribal societies in New Guinea over the last 50 years. And it's about what friends and other scholars have learned from other tribal societies around the world. All of us here this evening are accustomed to living in big industrial societies, in permanent housing, with centralized governments to make decisions, with writing and books and the internet, where most people live past the age of 60, where we daily encounter hundreds of strangers, just as I'm encountering you now, and where most of us eat food grown by other people. We forget that all of those things that I've just named arose very recently in human history. Humans have constituted a separate evolutionary line of biological evolution for the last 6 million years, but almost all of those things that I just mentioned didn't exist anywhere in the world 11,000 years ago. They all arose only within the last 11,000 years, and some of them arose only within the last century or decade or two. That is, the ancestors of all of us here were living under traditional tribal conditions until virtually yesterday measured against the time scale of human evolution. Until Europeans began to expand around the globe 500 years ago, tribal societies still occupied large parts of all the continents. But tribal societies have recently been coming under the control of modern societies with state governments, to the point where today the last tribal societies not yet under state control are confined to small areas of New Guinea and the Amazon basin. Those tribal societies, which constituted all human societies for most of human history, are far more diverse than are our modern big societies. All big societies that have governments, and where most people are strangers to each other, are necessarily similar to each other and different from tribal societies in many basic ways, regardless of whether our big societies are Australian, American, German, Chinese, Israeli, or Argentinian. Tribes constitute thousands of natural experiments in how to run a human society. They constitute experiments from which we ourselves might be able to learn. For example, today, if you think that modern Australian children enjoy too much freedom, or else if you think that Australian children don't have enough freedom, you cannot perform the decisive experiment of designating 2 Australian states where babies will be given the freedom to play with knives and fire, and 2 other states where children have to remain strictly subservient to their parents and grandparents, and 2 other Australian states where children continue to be treated as they are today. If we could only carry out that controlled experiment, we could come back in 40 years, compare the kids from all of those states, and quickly settle once and for all the question of whether it's better to raise Australian children with less freedom, more freedom, or the same freedom that they enjoy today. Unfortunately, it is impossible to carry out that decisive experiment in modern Australia. But there are thousands of traditional societies in which children already did grow up with either much more freedom or much less freedom than in modern Australia. By examining what actually does or did happen in traditional societies that are much more varied than modern Australian society, we may be able to learn things of practical use to us in deciding how to raise our children, how to treat our older people, how to remain healthy, and other things that we care a lot about. Tribal society shouldn't be scorned as primitive and miserable, but they also shouldn't be idealized and romanticized as happy and peaceful green environmentalists. When we learn of tribal practices, some of them will horrify us, but there are other tribal practices which, when we hear about them, we may admire and envy, and we may wonder whether we could adopt and adapt those practices for ourselves. To get some perspective on how we treat elderly people in modern Western societies, let me tell you the opinion of a Fijian friend of mine from the Fiji archipelago who had visited the U.S. There were some things that my Fijian friend admired about the U.S., other things that he disliked about the U.S., but what he most loathed about the U.S. was our treatment of older people. He almost shouted at me indignantly, "You Americans throw away your older people." By that he meant that most old people in the U.S. end up living separately from their children and separately from their friends and relatives, friends of their earlier years, and often they live in separate retirement homes for the elderly. In Fiji and other traditional societies, in contrast, older people instead live out their lives among their children, their other relatives, and their lifelong friends. Nevertheless, the treatment of the elderly varies enormously among traditional societies, from much worse to much better than in our modern societies. At the worst extreme, many traditional societies get rid of their elderly in one of 5 increasingly direct ways. The most indirect method to get rid of old people is just to neglect them and not to feed them or clean them until they die. The second method is to abandon them when a nomadic group moves on. The third method is to encourage older people to commit suicide. A fourth, more direct method is to kill older people with their own cooperation. For example, among the Kowloon people of the island of New Britain in Papua New Guinea, until 1957, it was the custom that when a man died, his widow called on her brothers or her sons to come strangle her, and she would sit on a chair while they pulled the rope around her neck. The fifth and most direct method of getting rid of the elderly is to kill them without their consent or cooperation. Now, in what tribal societies do children abandon or kill their parents? It happens mainly under two sets of conditions. One is in nomadic hunter-gatherer societies that often shift camp and that are physically just incapable of transporting old people who can't walk when the able-bodied younger people already have to carry their young children and all their physical possessions. The other condition for abandoning or killing old people is in societies living in marginal or fluctuating environments, such as the Arctic or deserts, where there are periodic food shortages, and occasionally there just isn't enough food to keep everyone alive. Whatever food is available has to be reserved for able-bodied people still capable of contributing to the tribe's survival, and for children who grow up to be the tribe's future adults. To us modern Australians and Americans, it sounds horrible to think of abandoning or killing your own sick husband or wife or father or mother. But what else could those societies do? They face a cruel dilemma. Their old people already had to do it to their own parents, and the old people know what now has to happen to them. For any of you who are nevertheless still inclined to blame those tribal societies for abandoning or killing their old people, let me quote the words of Winston Churchill about the behavior of the Japanese Admiral Kurita at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when Admiral Kurita had to choose between two equally horrible options. Winston Churchill said of Kurita, "Those of you who have endured a similar ordeal may judge him." In fact, many of you here, have already faced or will face an ordeal similar to the ordeal faced by those nomadic or Arctic or desert tribal societies when you are the physician or when you are the relative responsible for the medical care of an old person, and when you're the one who has to decide whether and when to halt further medical interventions, and when just to administer painkillers and sedatives for a sick spouse or parent. At the opposite extreme in treatment of the elderly, the happy extreme, are the New Guinea farming societies where I've done my field work for the past 50 years, and the village society, my Fijian friend, and many other sedentary traditional societies around the world. In those societies, older people are cared for, they are fed, they remain valuable, and they continue to live in the same hut or in a nearby hut next to their children, their relatives, and their lifelong friends. In traditional New Guinea societies where there are no dentists and where older people gradually lose their teeth and can no longer chew their own food, their adult children chew the food for them until it's soft, spit out the chewed up food into a cup, and give that soft, pre-chewed food to the toothless old person to eat. I don't know of any modern Western society in which such devoted care of old parents as pre-chewing food for them is routine. There are two main sets of reasons for all this variation among societies in their treatment of old people. The variation depends especially on the usefulness of older people and on the society's values. First, as regards usefulness, older people continue to perform useful services in traditional societies and also in our modern societies. One use of older people in traditional societies is that they often are still effective at producing food. Another traditional usefulness of older people consists of babysitting their grandchildren, thereby freeing up their own adult children, the parents of those grandchildren, to go hunting and gathering food for the grandchildren. Another traditional value of older people is in making tools, weapons, baskets, pots, and textiles. In fact, older people are usually the people who are best at those things. Older people usually are the leaders of traditional societies and the people most knowledgeable about politics, medicine, religion, songs, and dances. That's the origin of our expression, tribal elders. And to some extent, that's still true today. The average age of American presidents on assuming or reassuming the presidency is 54 years old. Finally, older people in traditional societies have one more huge significance that would never occur to us in our modern literate societies, where our sources of information are books and the internet. In contrast, in traditional societies without writing, older people are the repositories of information. Their knowledge spells the difference between survival and death for their whole society in a time of crisis caused by rare events of which only the older people alive have had experience. For example, in 1976, I visited a remote Polynesian island in the Pacific Ocean called Rennell Island in order to do an environmental impact study for a proposed mining project. As part of my study, I asked Rennell Islanders to tell me the name of each species of forest tree in their Polynesian language, and to tell me for each tree species whether its fruit or seed is edible. The islanders began to answer me. This tree's fruit is eaten by people. That fruit is eaten by bats, but not by people. This fruit is eaten by birds, but that fruit isn't edible to people or to any animal, and so on. Then they came to a tree of which they said, people eat this tree's fruit only after a hungi kenge. I didn't know what a hungi kenge is, but I let the islanders keep talking about more fruits eaten by people or by birds or by bats. Then they came to another fruit eaten just after a hungi kenge, and then several more fruits eaten only after a hungi kenge. And now I was really curious, so I asked them, so what is a hungi kenge? And why are there some fruits that you eat only after a hungi kenge? To answer me, the islanders took me to a hut in the back of which was sitting a woman around 80 years old who was now virtually blind and unable to walk. The islanders explained to me that when that old woman was only a teenager, Rennell Island had been hit by an enormous cyclone, which they called the hungi kenge, and which destroyed all the garden and much of the forest on Rennell Island. That left people at risk of starving, and so they survived by eating certain species of wild fruits that they normally wouldn't eat, but that old people alive at the time of the hungi kenge remembered had been eaten at the time of a previous cyclone. From historical records of Pacific Island cyclones, I calculated that the hungi kenge had hit Rennell Island around the year 1910, when the old woman that people were showing me was just a teenager. She was the oldest person still alive on Rennell Island at the time of my 1976 visit. If another big cyclone should now hit Rennell and again destroy the gardens and much of the forest, the only thing that would save the population of Rennell from starving to death would be the memories of that one old woman, the only person alive who remembered what fruits that were normally considered inedible were safe to eat when nothing else was available, and how to prepare them to leach out poisons and toxins. Her knowledge was what would keep her fellow islanders alive until their gardens began producing again. In the US and in Australia, we don't rely on oral memory. If you want to know what's the capital of France, you don't wander down the street till you find an old person. You instead look up the answer in a book or you Google it. More than any other incident in all my years of working on Pacific Islands, that story of the old blind and lame woman in the hut on Rennell Island made me appreciate the overwhelming importance of the knowledge of older people throughout human history, before there was writing. In non-literate traditional societies, the knowledge of older people spells the difference between life and death for their entire society.